My name is Janet Hardy. I'm a senior specialist at Bonham's Auction House in London, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Lawrence Hendra, who is a director and head of research at Philip Mould Gallery, and by Darren Clark, who is head of collections, research and exhibitions at Charleston Trust. So two great authorities on Charleston, and I'm delighted they've both joined us today to talk about this. So we'll be looking at Charleston, the Bloomsbury Muse, and both Philip Mould Gallery and the Charleston Trust have some excellent exhibitions on at the moment. And we're delighted to be hosted today by London Art Week, and this is one of their Art History in Focus webinars. So thank you very much for joining us. As you can see here, we've got two fantastic exhibitions on at the moment. On the left, we've got Charleston, the Bloomsbury Muse at Philip Mould & Co., which I hear has been a very successful exhibition so far with lots of people coming to view. And then on the right, we've got Duncan Grant, 1920 at Charleston. And so both of those exhibitions are on at the moment, and I know that both Lawrence and Darren would be delighted if you visited them. So I thought we would start initially with Darren. Perhaps you could give us some background on the Bloomsbury Group and Charleston. Here we've got Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell, and perhaps you could explain a bit more about who they were and the importance of Charleston to these two figures.
Sure. So the Bloomsbury Group, it's a group with a small g. So it's very much a group of friends. There's no dogma, there's no sort of manifesto. All about friendship. It starts in Cambridge. It starts at the end of the 19th century with a group of young men, these privileged young men, that were just coming of age as the old century was dying, as this Victoria was dying, and this sense that things should be changing, that they should have more freedoms, that the old sort of Victorian world, they should be sort of puncturing that pomposity, that hypocrisy, and being a much more liberated society. And these young men included Clive Bell and Lytton Strachey and John Maynard Keynes, Leonard Woolf, and Vanessa Bell's brother Toby Stevens was also one of them. And after they'd sort of finished at university, they wanted to continue that society. So they would meet at 24 Gordon Square, where Vanessa had moved her siblings to after their father died in 1904. And that's where Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf would meet these young men, and this sort of society without chaperones, so very shocking in the time. But there's sort of an equality of society. There was sort of the two women, there were all these young men, there were lots of queer figures in that group as well. And then Duncan Grant would meet a little later after he come back from Paris, sort of 1908. He then got to know the group much closer. And it was such a diverse group. So there were artists and art historians, Clive Bell and Roger Fry, who was a little older than the others, but also had been to Cambridge, and the economist Keynes, and the biographer Lytton Strachey, and even down to Saxon Sidney Turner, who was in the civil service, so has no sort of fame or public profile, but the group was about this group of friendships. And I think Charleston is like an extension of that, an extension of Gordon Square, a place where people come together and to discuss anything that they wanted to, where they could argue, but still remain friends after they finished arguing, and where they could live out those freedoms.
Fantastic. And I mean, I understand that when they moved to Charleston, it was extremely different to how it is now. I hear there were freezing winters, and it was at times perhaps quite an ordeal to get it up to a livable standard. Is that something you can tell us more about?
Sure. I mean, the house had been a guest house, so it's kind of comfortable in its own way, but it was in the middle of a field. It still is in the middle of a field. It had no electricity and no running water, and it wasn't on main sewage. So everything had to be done. So you had to have staff to keep the house going. So they brought staff with them from London. Water had to be boiled if you wanted to wash. Fires had to be made in the grate. Sort of the first winter they were there in 1916. Was one of the coldest of the century. So there was, water was freezing on toilets and on wash bowls. If you were coming to stay, you'd probably be asked to bring some blankets because there weren't enough blankets for everybody to keep warm. It was quite a sense of living in the countryside at that time. So they didn't have the facilities that they had in London. They didn't have their bathrooms and bathtubs and electricity. It was sort of gas lights and candles and all sorts of quite rudimentary life that they had to live there.
Fantastic. Well, here we have a photo of Charleston as it is today, and it really does look like a haven. And when Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell first moved there, the house really did perform a function as a shelter, both physically and kind of in a more metaphorical sense, because when they moved there in 1916, Vanessa moved with her 2 young children, with Duncan Grant and with David Garnett. And Duncan Grant and David required work as farm labourers because, as conscientious objectors, they needed an occupation during the First World War. So the farmhouse obviously seemed perfect for that function. And of course, it also allowed the group to have live their very sort of liberal sort of family and kind of sort of sexual relationships that at the time would have been quite frowned upon in sort of more conservative circles. Perhaps Darren or Lawrence, you can tell us a bit more about that. And I'll just take us on to the next slide. So this is Duncan and Angelica in the garden at Charleston. And Angelica was Duncan and Vanessa's daughter, born in 1918. And obviously when they moved, so Vanessa and Duncan were lovers, but Duncan also brought along David Garnett, his partner at the time. So this is obviously quite an unconventional relationship. And one of my favourite quotes about the Bloomsbury group of they lived in squares and loved in triangles is really sort of played out by this relationship. So Darren or Lawrence, would you like to tell us a bit more?
Want to go? I could tell you about, it was very much a place, they were kind of forced out of London, so they were conscientious objectors. They particularly objected to conscription that had been brought in at the beginning of the year. The government should tell one of its citizens how to act, who to fight for, what to do. That was just like a fundamental, sort of against everything that Bloomsbury stood for. Duncan Grant was there at the centre of this love triangle between David Garnett and Vanessa Bell. And they moved there. They needed a farmer that would employ them, and they needed somewhere to live. Vanessa Bell came down in September 1916 and found them for them, and they moved in October. So that's almost over anniversary of their moving. And it was very much, there were freedoms. It was an experiment in living, an experiment in this queer and political and household. But it was, and with all experiments, there were things that went wrong, and there were lots of jealousies and there were lots of arguments. They also had staff, and they had to sort of keep those relationships secret from the staff, probably secret from the children as well, that the sort of the things that they were doing, those sort of queer relationships, even Vanessa Bell having an extramarital relationship at that time would have been outrageous to sort of a wider society. So even though they had some freedoms, they were limitless freedoms. They had limits, they had controls over how they could act, even in their own home at that time. But yeah, that's how they kind of lived the rest of the First World War until 1918.
Mm-hmm. Great, and I think we've got here we have a painting in the Philip Mould exhibition at the moment, which is Interior with the Artist's Daughter. So Lawrence, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this painting, which obviously shows that sort of family relationship, but as how Darren says, it was even quite constrained, even within this liberal atmosphere at Charleston.
Okay.
Okay, I think we've lost you, Lawrence, but hopefully you're coming back.
I can tell you a bit about Angelica. So Vanessa Bell wanted to have another child. She had her 2 sons from her husband, Clive Bell. By 1916, they were no longer living together as a couple, but they were still really good friends. But Clive Bell and his lover, Mary Hutchinson, would visit quite often in that period. But Angelica she eventually was pregnant with Duncan Grant. Angelica was born Christmas Day 1918. And she was brought up as Clive Bell's daughter. So even that sort of stigmatism of being born outside of wedlock would have been too much for the family to take on. So she grew up, she was told that she was Duncan Grant was her biological father when she was about 17, 18, before the Second World War. And even then it was a secret amongst the family. You read biographies of the group, so Listen Straight's biography that was published in 1967, she is still Clive Bell's daughter. It's not until a later revision that she's actually told that she is Duncan Grant's daughter. Yes, there's always little secrets around.
Yeah, it's fascinating as well. I mean, in our more liberal society today, those sort of things seem almost unthinkable, but 100 years ago, it was still obviously an extremely different environment. So it's really interesting to be reminded of those small kind of secrets and things that still persisted. Lawrence, hopefully we've got you back now on the audio.
Yes, I think
Great.
So. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened.
Yeah. Great. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about this fascinating picture that's in your current exhibition.
Yes, this is a portrait of Angelica, and it's a painting done by Vanessa Bell within the studio, and that's the photo that you can see on the right here. I think for us, what this sort of really shows, and the reason why we wanted it in our exhibition, was just to demonstrate how sort of closely how much of a sort of an embracing kind of space Charleston was for the whole family. I mean, it was the place obviously where at the weekends they could all meet up, and of course the kids were at school, and it was after the war, it was between the wars, is a space they used at the weekends for sort of time away and family time as well. And there's another picture in our exhibition called the Hammock, which we'll see later on, that I always think really neatly visually summarizes what Charleston was about. And yeah, it was a space to enjoy family, enjoy one another. And and Angelica, she's featured in two pictures on our exhibition, and another picture is of her working on the loom within the house as well. And I think that family bond, as I said, is for us, it was a very important point to put across. Yeah, and as Darren already explained, I mean, of course there were all sorts of complexities with Angelica, especially with regards to her parentage, but she was obviously adored, and I think that's what's quite nice to see in these pictures, is the fact that they used their children and their family friends as sort of repetitive subjects for paintings. The people in particular, I mean, visitors to the house, of course it would be nice to see friends, but they also they were willing subjects to be painted, and so you have lots of very interesting pictures. John Maynard Keynes, for example, was painted at Charleston, which is in our show, and a portrait of Angus Davidson, who was one of Duncan Grant's lovers in the early 1920s. And it's just it's very interesting to see how, when I suppose the impact on their art it had with these people being in and around. It wasn't just the house, it was the people who came and visited as well. That really, I think, made Charleston, gave it that reputation. Yeah,
absolutely. And here we've got the Hammock, which is another picture in your exhibition at the moment, which really typifies that kind of wonderfully relaxed sort of feeling that they did have, with Angelica and Vanessa's two earlier children, and then also with their tutor as well, sort of reclining by the pond there. And just that sense of sort of relaxation and harmony, I think, is a lovely one. Even despite those constraints that they still had, it was sort of clearly still a haven for them all.
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a tough place to live, as we've heard earlier. But yeah, so it was a place where they were able to have that downtime, that family time. But what I love about this picture is the fact that, yes, you've got children, it's painted by Duncan, you've got Vanessa in the hammock, Quentin in the foreground, Angelica coming down the path, and Julian in the background. But it nods to Charleston's agricultural history as well. You've got the horse and cart in the background, because it was during the war, it was a working farm. I mean, there was these, in the Second World War especially, there were people who sort of write letters and later reminisced of the memories of Quentin driving tractors and the garden sort of full swing with vegetables being grown and whatnot. So I think it was very much, it came to life during these difficult times as well.
It also has this hidden queer history as well. So Sebastian Sprott is the two boys' tutor, but he was also John Maynard Keynes' lover at that time. He was like considered in Bloomsbury circles as a married couple. So he was able to employ him at Charleston and spend the summer at Charleston, and they were able to spend that time together at Charleston, away from London, away from prying eyes there, and at the same time sort of give it legitimacy that he was working for the family.
That's really fascinating, and sort of reminds us how those kind of links sort of cross over and over again within the Bloomsbury group, in a way that's often really quite surprising. And this is a portrait of Angus Davidson, who I think you mentioned earlier, Lawrence, as being one of the many friends that visited Charleston and sort of contributed to that feeling of a community being built up there.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I mean, yes, Angus Davidson and Duncan Grant were in a relationship at one point in the early 1920s, but Angus was always also part of that broader circle of friends as well. I mean, he was later employed at the Hogarth Press, which was the press which was run by Virginia Woolf and Leonard. But I think he was ultimately let go. I got the impression he didn't often like turning up to work on time. I think he was he wasn't particularly punctual, so he was they got rid of him in the end. But yeah, exactly. I mean, it's these paintings that I personally find the most enjoyable to look at, because it's a spontaneous moment. I mean, he's not doing anything particularly remarkable. I'm sitting down at a table reading or writing, but it's just the way that sort of friendship and that moment, and it's captured in that very distinctive kind of quick, boldly coloured manner. And I just think, for me, it's when you see a painting like this of Charleston with just the colours and the patterns, those are always my favourite pictures, I think.
Absolutely, and I think this interior scene brings us on quite neatly to something we haven't yet talked about, which is Charleston is sort of a blank canvas and a means of realising one sort of unified aesthetic ideal. Here's a picture that we have of the dining room, and as you can see, this is Charleston, and it's sort of in full flow of what we imagine the house to be like indoors, with the patterned wallpaper, the painted table, beautiful crockery that matches perfectly. And Darren, perhaps you could tell us more about how they sort of set about decorating the house in a style that we now sort of completely recognise to be sort of classic Charleston.
Well, I would take an opposite viewpoint, and I would say that it's totally ununified, that it is very much 50, 60 years of decoration layered on top of each other. In this room alone, you've got chairs from the Omega workshops from 1913, the stenciling on the walls is from 1939, the fireplaces from the 1920s, the table 1920s redecorated in the 50s. But it's very much an accumulation. It's not like London, and it's not like their commercial commissions, which are complete. They would design complete rooms with wall decorations and furniture and textiles and everything. But Charleston was, because it was for so many years just a place in the summer, it was the place where the second best stuff would go, where very cheap things would be. And then in 1939, with the advent of the Second World War, they decided to make it their primary home, gave up their places in France, in sublet in London, and brought a lot of things down. So that's when the Picasso came to Charleston and the Matisse and painted like that. So it was very much, when they moved in 1916, they had no vision that they were going to be there sort of for so long. They had a history, they had form of, if you lent them your house for the summer, you'd come back and things would be decorated. They had a house, they tried living in a farmhouse before Charleston, where they were there for 6 months, and they marbled doors and painted murals and all sorts of things that had to be scrubbed out when they left 6 months later. So there was never a sense that it had permanence. It was very much a sense of doing things as they were needed. So when they moved in, it had been a guest house, and all the walls were covered in very floral but very kind of bourgeois wallpaper. So the first thing they had done was to have the whole house painted, this wonderful soft greyish whitewash. that gave them a blank canvas for what unbeknown to them would be 50 or 60 years of decoration. And then things were decorated as and when. Did you want to put the next slide on? I can't remember.
Yeah.
There's the studio. So the studio comes a little bit later, in 1925. So after the end of the First World War, they weren't sure if they were going to stay at Charleston, whether they could get enough staff to live there because they wanted to go and work in the town. But they did, and they signed a long lease, and they were able to build this wonderful big studio. And again, it's Duncan Grant painted the walls and the chimney surround, but it has all this wonderful mishmash of furniture and objects and things that have sort of accumulated there. And then the next one of the garden room, which has a lovely little thing. Next slide. Of in the garden room at Charleston. So just to the right of the fireplace is a little log basket.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't think we've got that slide still, Darren. But
okay. Go back. You go back one. But the
it,
little log basket in the by the fireplace, that's the one. This tiny, just 5 pieces of wood, just really loosely nailed together, that can hardly be thought of as a piece of furniture at all, that Duncan Grant decorated soon after they moved in. These are wonderful figures that come from Italian frescoes, that come from the sort of the liveliness, the sort of energy, the sexuality of the ballet roots. So they're sort of bringing this post-impressionist aesthetic down to Charleston. They're bringing the Omega workshops they set up with Roger Fry in 1913 as this way of getting the post-impressionist aesthetic into the home. So they designed textiles and furniture and ceramics and children's toys and all sorts of things. Try and get this wonderfully vibrant, colourful effect into the home and into their houses. And so Charleston sort of takes that as its lead and runs with that over the years. And really is, I think, one of the charming things about it, one of the accessible things, is that it's not a big set piece. You need to sort of buy into everything. That it is small moments of creativity that you can sort of take away what appeal to you and what speaks to you.
I think that is one of the joys of Charleston, is that when you do walk around it, I mean, yes, you do see the grand sort of over-mantled pieces and the sort of roughly painted walls and the borders and the bookshelves and things, but it is things like the wood box. And I remember seeing that when we went down to Charleston to look at things to borrow for our exhibition, and things like that which you could easily miss, and were probably painted quite quickly, certainly compared to the wallpaper in the dining room. But it's just they have the most character. I mean, those objects more often than not are some of the most interesting, I think. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed out the wood box, because I was going to highlight that one as well.
But you've got the blanket box in your exhibition, which again is a piece from the same period and has such a beautiful and vibrant decorations on it. And again, it's such a rough piece of furniture. It's got nails, it's got splinters, it's got all sorts of things sticking out, but it's got these beautiful elevated designs on it. Yeah,
and I think it's quite important to note as well how certainly in the Omega workshops in the sort of the earliest of 1913 to 1919 period, that's the linen box, by the way, so yeah, we'll leave that slide there. But unlike the Omega workshops, for example, where they would sometimes have sort of furniture and beautiful sort of furniture made, in instances like this, these were very much found objects, with the impression I get, Darren. So this would have been something that they could have picked up from, say, Lewis at a flea market or something. You know, said during the war, times were hard. They came across these things and then they decorated them. And I think, as much as I love the Omega workshop pieces, I do think these ones that sort of fall outside of that area are just as, if not more, at times more interesting, because it was just that pure spontaneity and not particularly flying under any specific banner, just things that they just turned their hand to and painted. And I do love that linen box. Yeah, this is one that's in our exhibition. You open the lid and you've got this nude figure with the duck as well, sort of framed almost like she's on a stage, and it's painted on all 4 sides. You've only got this one image, but it's sort of really lovely.
Yeah, it's got a figure. It's leader and the duck rather than leader and the swan. Yes. So again, it's taking this really violent and sort of patriarchal story and puncturing that patriarchy and bringing this sort of flapping duck creature rather than a sort of aggressive swan to the story, and then that sort of hidden under the lid, but still with that sort of performative curtain, very similar to Venus and Adonis, which we talk about later, that's in the 1920 show. Sort of a similar composition, but also similar ideas. And then the wonderful swimmer on the front, who's so, I mean, it looks like you just want to be that swimmer and be swimming through those green sort of lapping waves.
It is really beautiful, yes. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the Omega workshops. Obviously, they were founded in 1913 and closed in 1919. And how similar or different would, for example, a painted chest like this have been to what they created in the Omega workshops?
Yeah.
Well,
go
over to you, Darren, you go.
I was going to say, it's I think if you bought something from the Omega workshops, it would have been a higher quality. So they employed cabinet makers to make the furniture which they decorate. I think the Omega workshops are rooted in the 1910 Money and the Post-Impressionist exhibition that Roger Fry curated, put together, and where he brought over artists like Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Gauguin sort of en masse to the UK for the first time. So these three artists were dead by 1910. They had no reputation of presence in Britain. So he brought them over, he outraged the old guard, he sort of really excited younger artists like Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, and just changed the way that people were making art and appreciating art. He followed that up with the 1912 Post-Impressionist exhibition, which widened the criteria away from France, looked at Russia, looked at Britain, Italy, and all sorts of different countries, including Bloomsbury artists like Bell and Grant and their circle. And then he wanted to continue that. So he started with the Grafton Group, an exhibition of household objects, and then on to the Omega workshops that were set up in Fitzroy Square, which was both a shop, a room, a space as well, a political space where guests could meet, where Belgian refugees met, and where they had fundraising events for Belgian refugees, where conscientious objectors could meet, where there's this kind of safe space that people needed at that point when there was so much jingoism and the sort of all the sort of brouhaha around the First World War. And they did their own textile jigs. Here's a wonderful postcard of a trade show that they were involved with the carpets and the textiles and the furniture and everything, all really so different from what you could buy in the high street, and even the sort of high-end high street around them. And it was a very much I mean, I can imagine the excitement of going into that building. Even before you went into the building, there were two big banners by Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant of dancers in this wonderful sort of futurist style outside the building.
Yeah, and looking at this and going back to what you were saying earlier, I can absolutely see how this was that much more designed compared to the so how everything at Charleston was more spontaneous and kind of piecemeal and built up over many years. You can really see here the kind of structure in that space and how the designs, for example, the geometric pattern on the curtains is kind of mirrored in those in the rugs on the floor as well. So I can sort of really see that this is a very unified sort of expression of that. And I can well imagine the excitement at the time. It really was something quite revolutionary, both as a social space and as a kind of interiors concept. So that's, yeah, it's fascinating to hear that. Thank you. And here we've got another couple of examples from the Omega workshops as well. Perhaps, Lawrence, you could talk us through these.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is really what is sort of a good example of what they were trying to do. I mean, this was bold, simplified form, brightly coloured, striking, very, very different to what Darren said you'd expect to see in the high street. And work on the left is by sort of painting designed by Roger Fry, and then the one on the right is called the Lily Pond Screen, and this is by Duncan Grant. And the Lily Pond Screen, this design was one that Duncan applied to tables and to various other sort of items of furniture. And I think it's perhaps inspired by Roger Fry, a pond at Roger Fry's house. And I think his earlier designs using sort of lily pond design was sort of slightly more representational. But then as time went on, they became more sort of loose, slightly more sort of, dare I say, abstract. And this is the screen, and it's beautiful. But you can, again, they're different designs, very different designs, but unified in this simplification, bright colours, yes, it's a shame more examples don't survive, or indeed a full scheme and full interior scheme, but yeah, long gone, sadly.
Yeah.
And there was the whole, I mean, there was part of Roger Fry educating the British people. So none of the objects at the Omega were signed by the designers or the makers. They were all signed with the Omega symbol. So you had to rely on your own sort of taste and your sense of what you wanted to buy. So you didn't know who you were buying. And you could go in and you look at a portfolio of designs. You say, right, I want that lily pond design on a chest of drawers or a table or a screen, and then it would be made for you. So it wouldn't necessarily be designed by Duncan Grant, but not necessarily. So there was a whole sort of project that I was working on through his public work of education.
And so, by comparison, Darren, what would these items of cost compared to, do you think, the equivalent, the high street equivalent? Because I've tried to sort of figure this out before, and I've noticed that a lot of the patrons were well-to-do, a lot of people of title, but where would it sort of compare, do you think, in the grand scheme of things?
I think Fry tried to pitch them at an affordable level, but I think it was the more the kind of what people would want in their homes. So people like Mary Hutchinson or Ottilie Morale, these sort of high society hostesses that were in the art world, that were patrons, would be very happy, even sort of would have to have Omega things in their house to show that they understood them, or that they were sort of in with that world. And I think they would have been too kind of a bit too outrageous for maybe more middle class tastes. I mean, they had a presence in the media. They were always getting reviews. There was some lovely sort of descriptions of the black ceramics that they produced. I think they were sort of so I think they were affordable to a middle class audience, but whether they or that audience could afford to risk their status by having such avant-garde things in their house is something else.
And that brings us sort of quite nicely onto the next topic that we wanted to talk about, which is sort of circling back to Charleston as the Bloomsbury Muse, and as a house sort of as something that enabled them to sort of, having found sort of freedom in life, so to speak, in this amazing setting, to be able to express themselves more fully in their art. And here we have the first painting that Vanessa Bell actually painted at Charleston, a beautiful landscape from 1916. And you can see here sort of these lovely bright colours that she's used, and sort of really quite a bold composition, a simplification of forms. And I was hoping, Lawrence, you'd be able to talk us through kind of the particular history of this painting, which I understand is in your exhibition at the moment as well.
Yeah, I mean, this has been probably the most popular picture in our exhibition. I mean, despite the fact it's sort of this kind of size, there's something about it, the way the forms are arranged, the sort of quite highly pitched use of colour. It's the work people are drawn to the most. And I said it's quite amazing because it's sort of a tenth of the size of some of the other pictures we've got. But I think that just sort of speaks of its success, because I mean, what Vanessa Bell was so referencing here, of course, the European modern artists. I mean, as Darren said, Roger Fry's 1912 exhibition, Man and Post-Impressionists, had a profound impact on that younger generation of artists, Vanessa Bell, Duncan Grant especially, and you really see it in this. You see the bright colours, the sort of Cézanne type treatment of the trees, especially the one on the left, and that sort of very simplified arrangement of forms. And so I think this is the reason really why we chose this as the starting point of our show, because this is the first picture she painted. Right. But of course that's just this specific picture, but the environment surrounding Charleston, the ponds, the barns, they also had a big impact on their work. I mean, the pond was an area that Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant painted endlessly. They enjoyed the play of the light on the water and the view across the pond over to the South Downs beyond. So it's, yeah, the land immediately surrounding Charleston was equally as important as the people who visited and the house itself, really. The whole family responded to it, the artists, but also the children. You know, it was the children would have sort of played in these trees, would have played on the pond. It was, again, it's sort of the centre of Charleston, this pond, really, and this is sort of what, in my mind anyway, sort of held sort of that sort of centre of the house, or the hub of it all, really.
Absolutely, yeah. And we have another example actually of one of Duncan Grant's works that he painted, a very early one from 1920 or 1919, which is in the current exhibition at Charleston. And I mean, this is obviously the vivid colours, the very experimental composition, the kind of unusual way of looking at the female nude, all things which kind of show a real freedom in his painting. And perhaps, Darren, you can tell us a bit more about this.
Sure. So it's Venus and Adonis, 1919. Tate collection. It's in the Duncan Grant 1920 exhibition. It was one of the ones most written about in reviews in his first solo exhibition. It's quite unlike a lot of the other paintings in that show. It's such a show. A lot of the criticism for the show was that it felt like an exhibition of two different artists. He's really at this sort of crossroads of moving styles. So he's had 10 years in this sort of avant-garde world of the Omega workshops. He hasn't shown a great deal of work, but he's been working a lot and he's been exploring and he's been developing. And so this was the first opportunity that he had to show 31 pieces in his first solo exhibition. And there were beautiful things like there were lots of still lives. There was Room with a View, which is a wonderful explosion of colour, shows Vanessa Bell and Angelica sitting in the walled garden, that first sort of spring of peace after the baby had been born, after the end of the war. And then there were sort of things that were much more abstracted, like Venus and Adonis, and some of the still lives that sort of those sort of forms. And he struggled with this one. He writes to Vanessa Bell back in sort of 1918, having trouble with his big red nude, that he's sort of, so it feels more instinctive than it was to paint. It sort of was quite a struggle for him. It has it's a repeated theme of Venus and these composition. So it repeats in quite a lot of his work throughout his career, and he sort of refers back to Venus figures in history. It has that distinctive billowing curtain that gives it both domesticity, but also a theatrical element that puts her on a stage that she's sort of performing in some kind of way. She's got this wonderful sort of really not interested in this at all kind of look on her face, and then these wonderful sort of wonderful limbs, a wonderful body that extends across the canvas, and then the tiny figure of Venus, of Adonis, sort of going off towards death. And so all these different influences of French post-impressionism, of Italian Renaissance artists, bringing them together in this wonderful bright work.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it feels like a very intense work. It's so highly coloured. It sort of really jumps out at you. And I mean, I'm sort of imagining him trying to paint that figure with all its twists in. It must have been quite difficult to really kind of get that worked out and get the perspective correct. With her limbs going different ways and things. And then the next piece I'd like to talk about is obviously sort of for Duncan, we know that he painted the male nude a lot, and obviously this is another kind of element of the freedom that perhaps Charleston enabled them to have, in that he did a great number of these nude studies. Here we have just an example, a few that actually Bonhams have sold over the last few years. But there was a large gift of, I think, around 400 works that were given to Charleston recently, all of very explicit drawings. And I understand they were gifted to, I think it was Edward Lebas to begin with, in a folder marked, "These drawings are very private," and sort of kept quite secret for a number of years, and, you know, shown to friends, and then they've recently, in the last couple of years, been gifted to Charleston, which sort of is another element of his artwork, which at the time would have been sort of extremely controversial and not able to have been exhibited or really shown outside a very limited circle of friends. So perhaps you can tell us more about that, Darren.
Yes, certainly. So yeah, there's always, Duncan Grant was a queer artist, and he was always interested in the male body. You can see that in The Swimmer on the blanket box. You can see that in his first public commission for the Bathers. That's in the date now. There's this wonderful collection of work, both the works that we were given, the 422 works that we were given last year, but also other works that he did over the years, of these wonderful erotic sensual figures and couples and all sorts of combinations of people. And they were, I mean, they were, the works that he gave to Edward Lebas were illegal. They could have been sent to prison for just possessing them. They were thought to have been lost. They were thought to have been destroyed by Edward Lebas' family after he had died, to protect his reputation. But thankfully they survived, and they went to another friend of Duncan Grant's, Eddie Knowles, who then left them to his partner, Matty Reddiff, who then left them to his partner, who then eventually gave them to the Trust last year, the really, really generous gift. And there's sort of this idea that they could probably never be shown publicly because of the content. There was like a resistance to them, in the people were worried in how they reflected on Duncan Grant and his reputation. And I think that the Trust, the Charleston Trust, is now in such a position that we want to celebrate that life, queer part of Bloomsbury in all its aspects and all the permutations that it gives. Yeah, and then, I mean, most of the works were done in London, I think, and it's like a London life. So by the 1940s and the 50s, I think Charleston was much more, because Vanessa Bell was living there full time, it wasn't just a summer place. I think Duncan Grant's queer life was being led more in London, that his old friends would come and visit, but that his young lovers would be he would see them elsewhere. And I think there's such an energy. I mean, these are good examples. There's Paul Roche, who he met in 1945-46, who would become his sort of friend, companion, muse, lover, and he painted him and drew him many, many times and photographed him many, many times. But there are also other more this whole life of queer experience that comes out in his drawings as well. There's passions and all sorts of things, and they're sort of and they're all very sensual, and they're all very sensitive. They're not sort of aggressive anyway. They're not there's no peril for the people involved. There's a real sense that it's all consensual and it's all really inclusive. And so we're working on an exhibition to show them, some of them, next year. So look out for our exhibition program 2022. See them in next September. But yeah, it's an important part of Grant's work and his life experience that we're celebrating.
Definitely, yeah. Oh, well, it's great to hear they'll be exhibited next year, so we'll be looking out for that. I'll just finish on, we have time for questions, but I'll just finish here on giving you all the details of these two wonderful exhibitions, which are still on at the moment. So at Philip Mould, we've got Charleston, the Bloomsbury Muse, on until the 10th of November. And at Charleston itself, we've got Duncan Grant 1920, which is on until the 13th of March. So plenty of time to go and see them both. And I'm sure you'll join me in thanking Lawrence and Darren very warmly for their amazing expertise. It's been really fascinating to hear all your insights into this fascinating group of people. And I see we have some questions already. So we have a question from Toby Walker, which is, during what years was Duncan Grant living in the house, and did Vanessa stay throughout?
Yeah, so they moved in 1916. So they were there pretty much full time until 1919. And then it became a summer place. So they would have their big studios in London. They had a house in the south of France, which they'd spend the winter at. They had, quite often they would go to Rome, rent a studio for a month or two, or in Paris. And Charleston was very much, I mean, in the August, September, July, August, September is sort of where it's very, very beautiful and hot and warm and comfortable. And they'd sort of spend their summers there. Sometimes they go at Christmas, but it was freezing. And so it was, they always rented the house. It was rented by the from the Furl estate. So they both, pretty much shared it together. Vanessa Bell died in 1961. She died at Charleston, and Duncan carried on living at Charleston. He had a flat in London as well, and he would he had friends, he had supporters, he had family that would look after him and make sure he was okay. But eventually he died. He died at Paul Roche's house in 1978.
Thank you very much for that answer, Darren. So we have a couple of other questions, including, are there catalogues for both exhibitions? And also Amanda Moore was asking if there's a book on this subject. So I'm sure there'll be catalogues for both. And I wonder, Darren, if you, or Lawrence, if you've got any particular reading recommendations for this area.
Yeah, I mean, The Art of Bloomsbury, I think, is a very good starting point. That was an exhibition catalogue done for a Tate exhibition. Would have been in, goodness, 1999, Darren.
Yeah.
That's that I think is a very good overview. I mean, that does exactly what it says on the tin. It is The Art of Bloomsbury, and it gives examples of painted furniture, paintings by Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell, Roger Fry, portraits, landscapes. So I think that's probably what I recommend as the go-to. Darren, do you any other ones you could?
Yeah, obviously I'm the Bloomsbury Muse, or no, Charleston Muse would be an excellent book to start. So there's a catalogue at Mould, and there's a Charleston Press for Duncan Grant, which is a little delayed, which will be out in the next couple of weeks. So look out on our website for that. I think there's a good book, another book by which is shown, called The Bloomsbury Portrait, which focuses on Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant and their sort of development up to about the 1920s. We have a book called Charleston, a Bloomsbury House and Garden, which is written by Quentin Bao and his daughter Virginia Nicholson, which is very much a history of the house and the people that live there from Quentin Bao's perspective. So there's some wonderful personal details of life there. I would certainly get that, and that's available from our website too.
And there's several books as well, actually, on the Amiga workshops as well, sort of independently. But yeah, it's we're quite lucky because I think the Bloomsbury group have been so widely published on that there's lots of very interesting material out there to read. But yes, as Darren said, there are catalogues for both exhibitions as well.
Mm-hmm.
And Toby Walker was asking what format the nudes were in. The nudes that we showed you were all painted on canvas. I think the majority that have been gifted to Charleston, a lot of them will be studies on paper. And certainly we've seen quite a lot of the studies on paper come through auction as well. But I thought I'd show you some really nice examples on oil, just because they're sort of as full as possible. And we had another question from Amanda Moore asking if there is any way to see these exhibits online or via Zoom. I'm imagining that sort of both exhibitions are mostly in person, Darren and Lawrence, but is there any opportunity of seeing them online?
We don't have them online yet. I don't know if they're going to be archived later and put online. But yeah, it's but the catalogue is fully when the catalogue comes out, it's fully illustrated with all the different works in the exhibition. some of the works that couldn't get to the exhibition too.
I think on our website we have a few examples. We also have a lot of them on our Instagram feed as well. So if you're on social media, do look at Instagram, because we've been posting throughout the course of the exhibition a different work each day, more or less, as well as some install shots of the space itself, so you can kind of get a better idea what it is like there. But yes, I think, as is always the case, I think visiting in person is always the best way to see these things.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. A question from Carmen Ross. To what extent was the group intentional about exploring and transcending class as a political dynamic that impacted their work?
I think they were always a product of their class. So they came from the Victorian age. They came from very well-connected groups. There's an interesting struggle with class. I think particularly you look at Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf and their work for the Labour Party and their supporting of workers. It's an interesting one. They always had staff and they always had support to enable them to be artists and build them to live their lives. And they always kept to those traditional sort of class structures in many ways. But Duncan Grant in particular had friends from all different stratas of society. And we know all about the posh friends he had and the letters that were kept, but we don't know enough about the working class queer men that he knew, the society that he kept, the people that were in the erotic drawings. There's a whole sort of hidden history there that we're sort of trying to piece together.
Great. Another question from Gunilla Treen. Are the painted interiors at Charleston protected in any way in order to last?
Yeah, we're a museum and we have accreditation. So we are fully, so that we are a proper professional museum. We have environmental controls for the building. We sort of keep a control on the light exposure. It's a very old house and it has sort of all sorts of issues with that. And the way we show the house and the ethos, people that saved Charleston, the way they wanted it shown that it is a home, not a building, not a museum, not a building, not a museum. Which so there is a balance between conservation and accessibility. But yeah, we are we're a proper museum.
Thanks, Darren. Another question from Teresa, which was, how do you feel the work at Berwick Church fits into the Charleston portfolio?
Well, the work at Berwick Church was painted during the war. It's painted during the 1940s. But I think what I've always found quite interesting about the Berwick Church commissions is that it was predominantly Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, but it was also more of a family affair. I think I'm right in saying, Darren, as well, wasn't there? There was also the children who sort of played their role in that as well. But I think in terms of sort of colouring, sort of scale, the drawing, I mean, it fits cohesively into what they were doing. But of course, I guess what's interesting is because obviously you've got religious subject matter, but in the case of the Annunciation, for example, you've got Charleston Garden Beyond. So you've got this scene with a very distinctly looking Charleston view in the background. So it's a sort of a combination of sort of, you know, of their life, Charleston, but also sticking to within the boundaries of a commission. You know, and it was a proper commission. But yeah, what would you say, Darren?
I mean, I think you can see its roots. So they went to Italy a lot. They studied frescoes and they studied murals in Italy. You see that sense of where biblical stories are updated to contemporary society in Renaissance times, and that's what they're doing with the biblical stories to 1940s Britain. And they're using Grace Higgins' son is sort of the nativity and the cook's son, and there's the gardener, and there's sort of all the local people that are included in the murals, and it's almost like a pageant. It's interesting. It's made the same time that Virginia Woolf was writing her final book, Between the Acts, which is very much looking at British society as a pageant and is surrounded in a pageant, and all sort of ideas of what British society is through this lens of a rural event. But you look at Duncan Grant's technique in particular, and I've been up on the scaffolding and had a right close-up look at it, and you see the technique he's using of these strips of color that are so similar to a fresco work in the Renaissance, and he was copying frescoes sort of right from when he was a young teenager. So yeah, it's a lifelong project that culminates in that work, I think.
And we have a few other questions. One was Edward Labat a kind of patron of Duncan Grant? As far as I understand, he was sort of a friend and fellow artist, but not necessarily a patron, unless Darren or Lawrence, you know any further on that?
He was very rich. His family were steel manufacturing, so he had a lot of independent wealth, which enabled him to be an artist. He was a really good friend with Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell. He was again a queer man, and so he and Duncan Grant would often share models and paint models together. But he also got on really well with Vanessa Bell, so they would go traveling together and they would visit Charleston as well. So yeah, he didn't support them financially, but he was a handy friend to have.
And another question was asking about how did they design or work in the garden? Do you know if there was did they follow any particular sort of planting guide for the garden, or was it sporadic or spontaneous, or It
was pretty spontaneous. Roger Fry laid out the walled garden, so it had been a kitchen garden beforehand when they moved in. So he sort of did these parterres with paths and flower beds and little lawns and things, and then the artists would just choose the flowers they wanted in the garden, choose the colors and the shapes that they wanted to include in their work that sort of captured their imagination. Over the years, sculptures were introduced, little ponds and pools, and mosaics and things. So it was like the house, it was evolved over the years. There wasn't one big overriding sort of design for it.
Great. Well, thank you for sort of elaborating on that. We have a couple of questions about one of the paintings in particular, so I'll just take us back to that, and we can sort of have a deep dive onto this. So we had a couple of questions with regard to this painting. So the first was, is there something symbolic with Julian being in the background? And then the second question was, Vanessa seems very disengaged and Angelica looks quite cross. The mood seems a bit at odds with the idea of idyllic country life. Could Darren and Lawrence comment on this?
Well, I think is there something symbolic with Julian in the background? I'd say not. This would have been a good sort of 15 years before he tragically died. I think it's it's obviously influenced in part by French painting it from an earlier date as well. I think this idea of sort of picnicking by the riverbank is something that obviously we see artists like Sprott explore. So I think it's probably inspired a bit by that, and I think it sort of strikes me mainly as a compositional sort of it provides that sort of depth that is required. So I think a part of it, but I mean, with regards to Vanessa and then the expressions, I mean, it's broadly painted, this picture. I mean, it isn't a sort of, it's on a big scale, but it's still quite broad. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think it's really about the sort of the overall sort of feeling of it, really. I mean, it's the sort of broad compositional elements as opposed to the finer details and the facial expression. I mean, up close, you are right. You can't really see much sort of expression as such from Angelica's face. But I said I don't think it was really intended to be that. I think it was supposed to be sort of monumental and broad. That's what I would say to that.
It's a study. So the final piece is in the Land Gallery in Newcastle. So this is a full-size study. I mean, a huge amount of work. And there were lots of other works that contributed to it. So lots of studies for the individual pieces. So it's probably looser than the final one. It's sort of brighter than the final one as well. And the final one, Grant sort of, maybe we consider it overworked from a modernist perspective. I don't think, I mean, it's really dodgy ground looking for symbolism in Bloomsbury paintings. But I mean, the first time I saw it, you think, oh, so Julian Bao, he left the country. He went to teach in Spain. He taught in Wuhan University in 1935. But there he is, crossing water. I think, I don't know, and Bao, I mean, Bao is supposed to be asleep. She's in the hammock. She's sort of having a rest. She's probably, I don't know, having a resting. She's sort of just having a little snooze. But I think it's an interesting idea to look for sort of narrative and story within the painting, but quite often Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell were following the idea of significant form and looking at the composition and how that works across the canvas, rather than giving position, meaning, or symbolism.
Great. Thank you both for elaborating on that. We've had a few more questions through. So one was asking when the exhibition of the erotic nudes will be. I understand that's in 2022.
In September.
Yeah, September, great. Another one asking, is Angelica still alive and was she an artist? As far as I'm aware, she died in 1980. Do you know if she was an artist at all, Darren, or...
She died in 2018.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Cut her off
I
short.
think she lived there until 1980. Oh, that was in my notes.
She was very much involved in the restoration of Charleston. So she did try living at Charleston after Duncan Grant died, but found it too much work and too much emotional weight to live there. But she was a big supporter of Charleston and visited quite often. She was an artist. She lived in France and produced work there.
Great. And one final question from Jeffrey Pickup, which was, Duncan Grant seemed to use several techniques in phases throughout his years. Do you think that late in life he had become comfortable in one or other way of painting?
I don't think so. I think you look at his work when he's in his 90s and it's incredibly vibrant. He uses so many colors, so many strokes of sort of such an energetic movement in his work. I think he's always experimenting and always trying out different things right through his life.
Great. And so Marianne Carson was asking who actually owns Charleston House now. Is it the Firle estate? But I understand it's operated by the Trust.
Yeah, Charleston Trust is an independent trust, so support it.
Great. And we've had a couple of people asking if the talk will be recorded and available to view later. Francesca, I don't know if you're able to help us with that.
Yes, will be recorded and shared via our platforms, the London Art Week platforms, in the coming weeks. So it's going to be available both online and on our website.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much again, Lawrence and Darren, for joining us for this Art History in Focus webinar. It's really fascinating and great as well that you managed to answer so many questions for everyone. So thanks so much for giving up your time today. And just to remind everyone that there will be another Art History in Focus talk tomorrow. This is the Black Presence and Portraiture at 5:30 p.m. So do join us tomorrow for another talk, which I'm sure will be really fascinating. And thank you again to London Art Week for hosting us, and to Darren and Lawrence for their amazing contributions.